My brother Theodore texted me last Tuesday afternoon while I was restocking shelves at work. Family meeting at Red Lobster on Hamilton Street, 7 o'clock sharp. Don't be late, loser. The loser part was classic Theodore. He'd been calling me that since we were kids, back when he got straight A's, and I struggled through algebra. The message had that specific edge that told me this wasn't about planning Mom's birthday or discussing Thanksgiving. Theodore only used that commanding tone when he wanted to assert dominance, remind me that he was the one with the MBA in the downtown office while I made $16 an hour wearing a name tag. I almost didn't go. My first instinct was to text back something sarcastic. Maybe ask if this was another intervention about my life choices, but something felt different about this summons. Family meetings at restaurants usually meant bad news delivered in public where I couldn't make a scene. So, I clocked out at 6:30, drove my beat-up Toyota across town, and walked into that Red Lobster at 6:55. The smell hit me first. Melted butter. Those Cheddar Bay biscuits they push on every table. And that particular seafood restaurant smell that's not quite fish, but not quite clean either. My family was already seated in a corner booth. The kind with high backs that give you privacy from other diners. They'd clearly been there a while. Empty bread basket, drinks already served, that settled-in look people get when they've been waiting. Mom, Dad, Theodore, and my sister Sylvia. All four of them sitting on one side of the booth, leaving me the opposite bench alone. It was a power move and they knew it. They had that unified front thing going, that particular configuration they'd used when I was younger, and they wanted to lecture me about my disappointing grades or my questionable friends or whatever way I'd failed to meet expectations that week. Dad didn't even wait for me to sit down before starting. We need to discuss your grandfather's inheritance. Just like that. No hello, no, how are you? No, we have some difficult news. Just straight into it like he was chairing a board meeting. The words took a second to process because nobody had told me Grandpa Harold was dead. That's how I found out. Sitting in a Red Lobster booth at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening while a waitress hovered nearby asking if I wanted to hear about the endless shrimp special. My grandfather, the one person in my family who'd ever acted like I mattered, was dead, and I was learning about it in a chain restaurant. I asked when he died. Dad said 3 weeks ago, peaceful in his sleep. They had a small funeral. I asked why nobody told me. Mom jumped in with this explanation about how I'm always so busy with my own life. They didn't want to burden me. They knew I had work and everything. Her voice had that particular falseness to it. The tone she uses when she's lying and wants you to know she doesn't care if you catch her. Sylvia added that it was a small service anyway, just immediate family and a few of Grandpa's old friends. The way she said immediate family, excluding me from that category without actually saying it, was perfectly calculated. Sylvia has always been good at that kind of subtle cruelty. Dad cleared his throat and continued like my grief was an inconvenient interruption. Your grandfather left an estate worth approximately $400,000. We're splitting it 4 ways, which comes to $100,000 each. He gestured around the table as he said it. Him, Mom, Theodore, Sylvia. He presented this like he was explaining simple mathematics to someone too stupid to understand. I sat there processing. 4 ways? I asked the obvious question. Don't you mean 5 ways? Theodore actually laughed out loud. That snorting laugh he's had since high school. The one that makes him sound like he's choking on his own superiority. No, he said, drawing out the word like he was talking to a child. We mean 4. Me, Sylvia, Mom, and Dad. He made a point of listing himself first. That was Theodore's thing, always making sure you knew he came first. Sylvia had this smirk on her face, the same expression she'd get when we were teenagers and she'd gotten away with something. You're not getting a penny, she said, casual as commenting on the weather. I kept my voice level when I asked why. It was taking everything I had to stay calm, but I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose it. Dad leaned forward, both hands flat on the table like he was about to deliver a verdict. Because, frankly, you're 30 years old, making $16 an hour and living in that dump apartment on Chester Avenue. You're a complete disappointment and a failure. We've decided to redistribute your share where it can actually do some good. Theodore needs funding for his MBA program, and Sylvia needs a down payment for a house. They've worked hard. They've made something of themselves. You just waste the money on video games and whatever else you waste your time on. Mom nodded along like this was the most reasonable thing anyone had ever said. Theodore has such a bright future ahead of him, and Sylvia's worked so hard to build her career. You have to understand we're thinking about what's best for the family as a whole. Best for the family, right? The family that didn't invite me to my grandfather's funeral. Theodore slid a stack of papers across the table. They made that sliding sound against the laminate. Sign these documents. You're legally releasing any and all claims to Harold's estate. If you refuse, we're prepared to make your life very difficult. Dad knows half the property owners in this city. Mom's best friend manages the store where you work. We have connections. We can make things happen. One phone call and you're looking for a new job. Maybe a new apartment too. The threat wasn't subtle. They weren't trying to be subtle. They'd sat down together and planned this whole ambush, picked the location, probably rehearsed their talking points, brought legal documents to a Red Lobster to force me to sign away money I didn't even know existed until 5 minutes ago. Sylvia was watching me with this eager expression, waiting to see what I'd do. Theodore had his arms crossed, looking smug. Mom and Dad just looked at me with that particular blend of disappointment and impatience they'd perfected over 30 years. Here's what they didn't know, what none of them knew. 3 months ago, I got a phone call at work. Old guy named Peter, who'd lived next door to Grandpa Harold for 40 years. Peter said Grandpa had been asking for me in his final weeks. Kept saying he needed to talk to me about something important. Peter gave me a name and number. Grace Chin, attorney, office near the courthouse. I called Grace that same day. We had a long conversation. She told me Grandpa had updated his will 6 months before he died. She told me about his very specific wishes, about how inheritance law works in this state, about how certain family members couldn't just decide to redistribute assets however they wanted. She also mentioned that my family had already contacted her multiple times, trying to rush the probate process, asking pointed questions about whether beneficiaries could be removed for various reasons. Grace didn't like them. She made that clear. She also made it clear that I had rights under the law and under Grandpa's explicit written wishes. So, I'd spent 3 months learning. I read everything I could about estate law in our state. I learned about executive responsibilities, about probate procedures, about what happens when beneficiaries try to coerce other beneficiaries. I learned about fraud and undue influence. I learned a lot. Grace had provided me with copies of the actual will, the real one, filed with the court, not whatever document Theodore was sliding across this table. I had documentation. I had legal standing. I had spent 3 months preparing for exactly this moment. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my own set of papers, thicker than Theodore's stack, more official looking. I set them on the table between us. Read these first, I said. The shift in energy was immediate. Dad grabbed the papers. I watched his expression change as he read the first page. His face went from confident to confused to something close to panic. Mom tried to read over his shoulder, squinting at the legal language. Theodore reached across and snatched the documents from Dad's hands, and I got to watch his smug expression crumble in real time. The papers explained several things. First, that Grandpa's will specifically named all 5 grandchildren as equal beneficiaries. Second, that attempting to coerce a beneficiary into releasing their claim was legally actionable. Third, that I had retained legal representation. Fourth, that any attempt to proceed with probate without including all legal beneficiaries would be contested. There was more, but that was the basic summary. I stood up. You can keep your Red Lobster intimidation papers, I said. My attorney will be in contact with whoever your probate lawyer is. We'll handle this through proper legal channels. Then I walked out, leaving them with their endless shrimp and their shocked faces. My phone started going off around 11 that night. First Theodore, then Sylvia, then Mom. Text saying we need to talk. This is a misunderstanding. We can work this out. I didn't respond. By midnight, the calls started. Dad's voice on voicemail saying I was being unreasonable. I was tearing the family apart over money. By 2 o'clock in the morning, all 4 of them were outside my apartment building. I live on the 3rd floor, and my windows faced the street. I could hear them down there. Theodore yelling that I needed to be reasonable. Mom crying, saying she didn't understand why I was doing this. Dad demanding I come down and talk like an adult. Sylvia's voice cutting through everyone else, saying they didn't know. They made a mistake. Please just open the door. I looked out my window at them standing under the streetlight. Part of me wanted to go down there and scream at them about the funeral I wasn't invited to, about learning my grandfather died at a Red Lobster. About 30 years of being treated like a failure and a burden, but I didn't. I'd spent 3 months getting ready for this. I wasn't going to blow it now by losing my temper in the middle of the night. I closed my blinds and went back to bed. My phone kept buzzing until almost 4 o'clock in the morning. Update 1 coming soon because this situation has gotten completely out of control. Welcome back to Hidden Lies. Update 1. So that first night with them screaming outside my apartment was just the beginning. I should have known they wouldn't just accept this and move on. That's not how my family works. When they want something, they don't stop until they get it or until you break. Wednesday morning, I woke up to my phone absolutely destroyed with notifications. Not just from the 4 of them anymore. Now it was aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't heard from in years. All of them with basically the same message, just worded differently. I needed to stop being selfish. I needed to think about the family. I needed to do the right thing and let Theodore and Sylvia have the money since they could actually use it properly. My Aunt Carol, Dad's older sister, left me a voicemail that was almost 5 minutes long about how disappointed Grandpa would be if he knew I was tearing the family apart over money. That one actually made me laugh because Carol hadn't spoken to Grandpa in over a decade after some argument about Thanksgiving seating arrangements. But sure, she definitely knew what he'd want. I went to work that Wednesday because bills don't stop even when your family is imploding. The store manager, a woman named Connie, who'd always been decent to me, pulled me aside during my break. She looked uncomfortable. She said my mother had called that morning. Mom wanted Connie to know that I was dealing with some mental health issues and might need some time off. Mom suggested it might be better for everyone if I took an extended leave, maybe focused on getting myself together before coming back. Connie was asking me if there was anything I needed to tell her, if I was okay, if I needed help. I told Connie the truth. My family was trying to cut me out of an inheritance, and now they were attempting to get me fired as leverage. I watched Connie's expression shift from concern to something else. Anger, maybe. She told me my job was secure, and if my mother called again, she'd handle it. Then she asked if I needed the Employee Assistance Program number for legal help. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be a quick fight. They were going to try to destroy everything I had to force me into giving up. Thursday afternoon, Theodore showed up at my apartment. I was getting home from work, and he was just standing there in the parking lot next to his Lexus. He'd clearly been waiting. He walked over before I could get inside and started talking before I could tell him to leave. He said we needed to have an actual conversation, adult to adult, without all the emotions and drama. He said Red Lobster was a mistake. They'd handled it wrong, but I had to understand their perspective. Theodore had his MBA program starting in 6 weeks. He'd already put down deposits. Sylvia had made an offer on a house, and the sellers accepted. They'd set everything in motion based on having that money. If I contested the will, if I forced this through probate court, everything would be frozen for months, maybe over a year. Theodore would lose his spot in the program. Sylvia would lose the house. I asked him why that was my problem. He looked at me like I'd said something incomprehensible. Because we're family, he said. Because when someone in the family has an opportunity to succeed, everyone else should support that. Theodore with his MBA would eventually make enough to help everyone. Sylvia with a house would have space for family gatherings, stability for when she had kids. What would I do with $100,000? Keep working retail, maybe buy a nicer car. That wasn't building anything. That was just spending. I asked him if Grandpa felt that way. If Grandpa thought I was just going to waste money. Theodore paused. He said Grandpa was old and sentimental. Grandpa remembered me as a kid and never updated his perception. He didn't understand that some people are builders and some people are just... He trailed off, but I knew what he wasn't saying. Some people are just failures. I told Theodore I'd been visiting Grandpa every week for the last 2 years. Every Sunday afternoon, we'd sit in his living room and watch whatever game was on. Sometimes we'd go to the diner on Morrison Street. Sometimes we'd just talk. Theodore's expression changed. He said that wasn't possible. Nobody visited Grandpa. He was in assisted living. He barely had visitors except holidays. I told him Grandpa moved to assisted living 14 months ago. Before that, he was still in his house on Maple Street. The house where I visited him every single week. The house where we'd have dinner and he'd tell me stories about growing up during the Depression and what it was like raising kids in the 60s. The house where he told me I reminded him of himself when he was young, before the family decided who he should be. Theodore just stood there. He actually didn't have a response ready. This wasn't part of whatever script he'd prepared. So I pushed harder. I asked Theodore when the last time was that he visited Grandpa. Actually visited, not just a phone call on his birthday or showing up for Christmas dinner. Theodore said he'd been busy. His career was demanding. Grandpa understood that successful people have obligations. I asked if Grandpa ever told him that, or if Theodore just assumed, because Grandpa told me plenty of things about what he thought of people who were too busy for family until they wanted something. Theodore's face went red. He told me I was being manipulative, trying to make him feel guilty when this wasn't about who visited more or who Grandpa liked better. This was about practical reality, about what made sense for the family's future. I told Theodore I had a copy of Grandpa's will, the real one, the one filed with the probate court. I'd read the whole thing. There was a section in it, a letter really, explaining his decisions, explaining why he divided everything equally among the 5 grandchildren, despite some of them barely acknowledging his existence for years. Theodore asked what the letter said. I could see he was trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I told him Grandpa wrote that some people measure success by money and titles and what other people think. Other people measure it by whether you show up when nobody's watching, whether you care about people even when they can't do anything for you. Grandpa wrote that he hoped all his grandchildren would learn the difference eventually, but he wasn't going to reward the people who only showed up when there was something to gain. Theodore was quiet for a long moment, then he switched tactics. He said, fine, maybe they'd handled this wrong. Maybe they'd been insensitive about the whole Red Lobster thing, but couldn't we work something out? Couldn't I just take 50,000 instead of 100,000? Let Theodore and Sylvia have 75 each. That way, everyone got something and nobody's plans fell apart. I asked if he seriously thought I'd negotiate after they tried to force me to sign away everything. After they threatened my job and my housing, after they didn't even tell me Grandpa died. Theodore said I was holding a grudge, that I needed to move past my ego and think about what actually mattered. I told him to leave. He didn't move. He said we weren't done talking. I pulled out my phone and opened it to my lawyer's contact information. I told Theodore he could leave voluntarily, or I could call Grace, and she could add harassment to the list of issues we'd be discussing in court. He left, but before he got in his car, he turned around and said this wasn't over. They'd hired their own lawyer, a good one, someone who specialized in contested estates. I could fight this if I wanted, but it was going to cost me more in legal fees than I'd ever see from the inheritance. I went inside and called Grace, told her about the conversation. She said she'd expected something like this. She also said Theodore was bluffing about the legal fees. Estate attorneys like her often worked on contingency for beneficiaries being wrongfully excluded. I wasn't going to be bankrupted fighting for what Grandpa wanted me to have. Friday, Sylvia showed up. Different approach than Theodore. She came to my work, waited until my shift ended, caught me in the parking lot. She was crying before she even started talking. She said her whole future was falling apart. The house she'd offered on, she'd already told everyone about it. Her fiancé, a guy named Atlas, who I'd met maybe twice, had already given notice at his apartment. They'd started buying furniture. She'd picked out paint colors. And now the sellers were getting impatient. The offer was contingent on financing, and the financing was contingent on her having money for a down payment. Money she'd told the bank was coming from an inheritance. If this dragged out, she'd lose the house. She'd lose her deposit. She'd disappoint Atlas. She'd have to admit to everyone that she couldn't make it happen. Sylvia said she knew I had reasons to be angry. She got it. But did I really want to destroy her life over this? Did I really want to be the reason she lost everything? I asked Sylvia if she remembered my high school graduation party. She looked confused by the question. I reminded her. She'd told everyone at the party that I probably wouldn't amount to anything, that I'd be lucky to get a job at a gas station. She'd said it loud enough for my friends to hear, for my then-girlfriend to hear. She'd laughed about it. Sylvia said that was 10 years ago. People say stupid things when they're young. I asked if she remembered last Thanksgiving when she'd made a toast about being grateful for family members who worked hard and achieved things. When she'd very deliberately looked at everyone except me while she said it. Sylvia said I was being oversensitive. That wasn't about me. I asked her if there was a single time in the last decade when she'd treated me like I mattered. When she'd asked how I was doing and actually wanted to know the answer. When she defended me instead of joining in when Theodore and Dad made jokes about my life. Sylvia said family teases each other. That's normal. I was making this into something it wasn't. I told Sylvia that Grandpa left me that money because he knew exactly who I was and he valued it anyway. The letter he wrote in his will mention me specifically. Mentioned how I showed up every week, even when I had to take the bus across town because my car was broken. Mentioned how I never asked him for anything, but always asked if he needed anything. Mentioned how I was the only grandchild who seemed to care about him as a person instead of as an eventually dead relative with money. Sylvia's tears stopped. She looked at me differently then. She asked how much Grandpa wrote about me. I told her it was over a page, single-spaced. She asked how much he wrote about her. I didn't answer. She asked again, louder this time. How much did Grandpa write about her in his will? I told her the truth. Her name appeared once, in the list of beneficiaries. Sylvia's expression went from sad to furious in about 2 seconds. She said I'd clearly manipulated an old man, that I'd taken advantage of his loneliness and convinced him I was some kind of saint. That it was disgusting that I'd used Grandpa like that. I told her to leave. She didn't. She stood there in the parking lot yelling about how I'd always been jealous of her and Theodore. How I'd never been able to accept that some people succeed and some people don't. How this was my pathetic attempt to finally matter to someone. A security guard started walking over. Sylvia got in her car and left. That night, Mom texted me. She wanted to meet for breakfast Saturday morning. Just the two of us. No Dad, no Theodore, no Sylvia. She said we needed to talk mother to son, figure this out before it got even worse. I knew it was a trap. I knew she was going to try some emotional manipulation about being a good son or respecting family. But I also knew this wasn't going away, and avoiding them wasn't going to work. I told her I'd meet her at the diner on Morrison Street, the one where Grandpa and I used to eat. 9 o'clock Saturday morning. She agreed. I had no idea what she was planning, but I wasn't going into it unprepared. Grace had already briefed me on what they might try, what I should and shouldn't say, what could potentially be used against me if this went to court. Saturday morning was going to be interesting. Update 2 coming soon on Hidden Lies. Update 2. Saturday morning. I got to the diner 15 minutes early. Same booth where Grandpa and I used to sit, the one by the window that looks out at the parking lot. I wanted to see Mom arrive, wanted to watch her compose herself before she walked in. Call it paranoia, but I'd learned not to trust any of them. She pulled up at exactly 9 o'clock in her silver Buick, sat in the car for a solid 3 minutes before getting out. I watched her check her makeup in the rearview mirror, take a few deep breaths. She was preparing for a performance. Mom came in looking tired, not just regular tired, but that specific exhausted look people get when they've been stressed for days. She slid into the booth across from me and immediately started with how she hadn't been sleeping. How this whole situation was tearing her apart. How she never imagined her family would be fighting like this. The waitress came over. Mom ordered coffee and wheat toast. I ordered the usual breakfast platter Grandpa always got. Mom noticed. She said it was nice that I had good memories of this place with Grandpa, that she was glad we'd had that relationship. I didn't respond. I just waited for her to get to the real reason we were here. Mom stirred sugar into her coffee and started talking about how Dad was impossible to live with right now. He was furious about the whole inheritance situation. Convinced I was being intentionally malicious. Theodore was spiraling because his MBA program was in jeopardy. Sylvia wouldn't stop crying about the house. The whole family was falling apart, and Mom was stuck in the middle trying to hold everyone together. She said she understood why I was hurt about not being invited to the funeral. That was Dad's decision. He'd said I was too unreliable, that I'd probably show up late or not at all, that it was better to keep it small. Mom had disagreed, but she'd gone along with it to keep the peace. She regretted it now. She should have insisted I'd be there. I asked if she regretted it, or if she regretted that it gave me ammunition. Mom looked genuinely hurt by that. She said she'd always loved me, always wanted the best for me, even if I didn't see it that way. The problem was that Dad had very specific ideas about success and masculinity and what men in our family should achieve. Theodore fit that mold perfectly. I didn't. And Dad couldn't handle having a son who didn't live up to his expectations. She said she'd spent 30 years trying to protect me from the worst of Dad's disappointment, trying to soften his criticisms, trying to make excuses for why I wasn't more like Theodore. It had been exhausting. I asked Mom if she was seriously trying to make herself the victim in this situation. She said no. She was trying to help me understand the family dynamics. Dad's father had been brutal to him growing up. Nothing was ever good enough. Dad internalized that and then projected it onto his own kids. Theodore got the approval because he performed. I got the criticism because I didn't. It wasn't fair, but it was how Dad was wired. I asked what any of that had to do with stealing my inheritance. Mom flinched at the word stealing. She said that wasn't what was happening. They genuinely believed that redistributing the money made practical sense. Theodore and Sylvia were at crucial life stages where money would make a real difference. I was stable. I had a job, an apartment, a life. I didn't need the money the way they did. I told Mom I made $16 an hour. I'd been at that same wage for 3 years because the store refused to give raises. My apartment was a studio with a broken AC unit that my landlord wouldn't fix. My car needed a new transmission, but I couldn't afford it, so I was driving it until it died. Stable wasn't the word I'd use. Mom looked uncomfortable. She said she didn't know things were that difficult for me. I never said anything. I asked when I would have said something. At the family dinners I wasn't invited to? The holidays where everyone talked about their accomplishments while I sat there being the cautionary tale? When exactly was I supposed to mention I was struggling? Mom's coffee was getting cold. She wasn't drinking it. She said maybe the family had failed me. Maybe they'd been so focused on Theodore and Sylvia's successes that they'd neglected to support me. But that didn't change the current reality. Theodore had already committed to his program. Sylvia had already made plans for the house. If the inheritance got tied up in probate for months or years, real damage would be done to their futures. I asked if Mom had read Grandpa's will, the actual will, not whatever summary Dad had given everyone. She said she'd seen parts of it. Dad's lawyer had reviewed it with them. I asked if she'd read the letter Grandpa included, the one explaining his reasoning. Mom shifted in her seat. She said Dad's lawyer had mentioned there was a letter, but it wasn't legally binding. It was just sentiment. The lawyer said judges don't care about emotional appeals. They care about law and precedent. I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I'd taken of Grandpa's letter. I slid the phone across the table. I told Mom to read it, all of it. She hesitated. Then she picked up the phone and started reading. I watched her face change as she went through it. Grandpa had written about each grandchild, about Theodore's ambition that seemed to come with a coldness toward people who couldn't advance his goals, about Sylvia's obsession with appearances and status, about the other 2 grandkids, cousins from Dad's brother, who Grandpa barely knew because they'd moved to Oregon years ago. And then the section about me, about how I'd shown up every single week, even when I was clearly exhausted from work, about how I'd helped him fix things around his house without being asked, about how I'd listened to his stories like they mattered, about how I'd once brought him groceries during a snowstorm because I was worried he'd run out of food, about how I reminded him of who he'd been before the world convinced him he needed to be someone else. Mom put the phone down. Her eyes were wet. She said she didn't know I'd done all that for Grandpa. She said it was beautiful that we'd had that bond. Then she said it anyway. Despite that beautiful relationship, despite Grandpa's sentiments, We still had to be realistic about the current situation. Couldn't I take a smaller share? Even 60,000 instead of 100,000, that would still be life-changing for me, but it wouldn't destroy Theodore and Sylvia's plans. I took my phone back. I told Mom that Grandpa's letter wasn't just sentiment. It was evidence that he'd been of sound mind when he made his will. It was proof that he'd carefully considered each beneficiary and made deliberate choices. It was documentation that would make any legal challenge very difficult for them. Mom's expression hardened. She said I was being vindictive. This wasn't about the money for me. It was about punishing the family for every perceived slight and rejection I'd ever felt. I told Mom she was wrong. This was absolutely about the money. It was about respect. It was about the fact that Grandpa valued me enough to leave me an equal share, and I wasn't going to let them take that away because they decided I didn't deserve it. Mom said Dad was talking about contesting the will on the grounds that Grandpa had been unduly influenced, that I'd manipulated an elderly man into favoring me in his final wishes. I asked if she understood what that would require. They'd have to prove Grandpa wasn't mentally competent. They'd have to prove I'd isolated him from the rest of the family. They'd have to explain why nobody else had visited him regularly if he was so vulnerable to influence. They'd have to admit in court that they'd barely maintained a relationship with him. Mom was quiet. Then she said Dad was determined. When Dad decided to fight something, he didn't stop. He'd burn through their savings hiring lawyers if that's what it took. He'd make this so expensive and so drawn out that I'd give up just to end it. I told Mom that Grace had already explained that strategy. It was a common intimidation tactic, but estate lawyers often worked on contingency. I wasn't going to be bankrupted. They might be. Mom stood up. She hadn't touched her toast. She said I'd changed. I used to be sweet and easygoing. Now I was cold and calculating. She didn't recognize me anymore. I told her I'd spent 30 years being sweet and easygoing, and it had gotten me excluded from my own grandfather's funeral. Maybe she didn't recognize me because this was the first time I'd ever stood up for myself. Mom left. She didn't pay for her coffee. I picked up the check. That afternoon, Dad showed up at my apartment. No warning, no text, just pounding on my door at 3 o'clock. I looked through the peephole, and there he was, red-faced and clearly furious. I opened the door but kept the chain on. I asked what he wanted. Dad said we were going to settle this right now. He was done with lawyers and negotiations and all this nonsense. I was going to sign a document releasing my claim, or he was going to personally destroy every aspect of my pathetic little life. I asked how he planned to do that. Dad listed it out. He'd call in favors to make sure I couldn't rent anywhere in the city. He'd spread word through his business contacts that I was unstable and litigious. He'd make sure I couldn't get hired anywhere better than where I already worked. He knew people. He had connections. He could make me unemployable and homeless. I asked if he'd practiced that speech or if it came naturally. Dad slammed his hand against the door frame. He told me not to be a smartass. This was serious. Did I really think I could go up against the whole family and win? Did I really think some retail worker with a sympathetic dead grandpa story was going to beat them in court? I told Dad that Grandpa's lawyer had already filed the will with probate court. It was public record now. The letter Grandpa wrote was attached to the filing. Anyone could read it, including Theodore's MBA program administrators if they happened to look into why his funding was being contested, including the family friends Dad was threatening to poison against me. Dad went very still. He asked what I meant by that. I told him that Grace had been very thorough. She'd documented everything from the moment Peter called me. She'd documented my regular visits to Grandpa. She'd documented the timeline of when my family contacted her, trying to manipulate the probate process. She'd documented the Red Lobster ambush, the threats to my job, the harassment outside my apartment at 2 o'clock in the morning. If Dad wanted to make this a public fight, we could do that. We could have a judge read about how my family excluded me from a funeral and then tried to force me to sign away my inheritance while threatening to destroy my livelihood. We could have all Dad's business contacts learn how he treated his own son. Dad's face was purple. He said I was bluffing. I wouldn't humiliate the family like that. I told him he'd humiliated me my entire life. At this point, I had nothing left to lose. Dad stared at me through the gap in the door. Then he said I was just like Grandpa, too proud to admit when I was wrong, too stubborn to do what was practical. Grandpa had died alone in an assisted living facility with nothing but memories, and I was headed the same direction. I told Dad that Grandpa died with at least one person who actually loved him. That was more than Dad would have if he kept this up. Dad left. Didn't slam anything, didn't make threats, just walked away. Somehow, that was worse than the yelling. Sunday, Theodore texted me. His lawyer had filed a formal contest to the will. They were claiming undue influence and questioning Grandpa's mental competence during the time the will was written. The probate process was now officially frozen until the court could review both sides. Grace called me an hour later. She'd received the filing. She said it was weak. Theodore's lawyer was fishing. They didn't have evidence of incompetence or influence. They had a theory, and they were hoping the threat of a prolonged legal battle would make me settle. Grace asked if I wanted to settle, if I wanted to make this go away. I thought about Mom's tired face across the diner table, about Dad's threats in my doorway, about Theodore's smug confidence and Sylvia's entitled tears, about 30 years of being treated like a disappointment because I didn't perform success the way they demanded. I told Grace no settlement. We were taking this all the way. She said it might get uglier before it got better. They'd use every tactic they could think of. They'd try to paint me as a manipulator, as someone who took advantage of an old man. They'd bring up every mistake I'd ever made, every job I'd lost, every relationship that failed. They'd make me look as pathetic as possible to justify why Grandpa couldn't have genuinely wanted to leave me an equal share. I told Grace I understood, and I was ready. Because here's what they didn't know. During those 2 years of weekly visits, Grandpa had recorded some of our conversations. He'd used a little voice recorder he kept on the table. He told me he liked to listen back to them, that it helped him remember things in between visits. I had those recordings, hours of them. Grandpa talking about his life, about his values, about why family should mean more than money or status, about how disappointed he was that his own children had become so focused on achievement that they'd forgotten how to be kind. About how glad he was that at least one grandchild still knew how to just sit and talk. If Theodore's lawyer wanted to question Grandpa's state of mind, we had documentation of exactly how sharp and thoughtful Grandpa had been right up until his final months. Final update coming soon on Hidden Lies. Final update. The probate court hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after Theodore filed his contest. Grace explained it wasn't a full trial, more like a preliminary hearing where the judge would review both sides and decide if Theodore's claim had enough merit to proceed to actual litigation. If the judge found Theodore's evidence weak, the will would be validated, and we'd move forward with distribution. If the judge thought there was a legitimate question about undue influence or competency, we'd be stuck in court for months or longer. Those 3 weeks were brutal. The family group chat that I'd been passively part of for years exploded with activity. None of it directed at me since I wasn't responding, but I could see everything. Sylvia posted about how stressed she was, how she couldn't sleep. Theodore shared an article about elder abuse and manipulation tactics. Mom sent daily messages about family unity and forgiveness. Dad was silent in the chat, but I knew from Mom's messages that he was the one pushing hardest behind the scenes. The extended family got involved. Aunts and uncles I barely knew started texting me. Some were sympathetic, saying they'd heard my side and understood why I was hurt. Others accused me of destroying the family over money. Aunt Carol, Dad's sister, sent me a long text about how Grandpa had always been easily swayed by whoever spent the most time with him. How I'd clearly taken advantage of that. I didn't respond to any of them. Grace had been clear about not engaging, not saying anything that could be twisted or used later. Everything went through her. Theodore's lawyers sent discovery requests. They wanted documentation of every visit I'd made to Grandpa's house. They wanted bank statements showing I hadn't received money from him before he died. They wanted character references. They were building a case that I'd been financially motivated from the start, that I'd befriended an old man specifically to get into his will. Grace had prepared for all of this. We had the visitor logs from the assisted living facility showing my weekly visits continued even after Grandpa moved there, when the inheritance was already set in stone. We had statements from Peter, Grandpa's neighbor, confirming I'd been visiting for 2 years. We had receipts showing I'd often brought Grandpa groceries or picked up his prescriptions, never asking for reimbursement. And we had the recordings. Grace had listened to all of them. Hours of conversations between me and Grandpa. She'd selected specific clips that demonstrated his mental clarity, his deliberate thinking about the will, his explicit statements about being disappointed in how some of his family had treated him. The day of the hearing, I wore the only suit I owned. I'd bought it at a thrift store 3 years ago for a job interview that went nowhere. Grace met me outside the courthouse. She looked professional and confident. She told me to stay calm, answer questions directly if asked, and trust that the evidence spoke for itself. Theodore showed up with his lawyer, a guy in an expensive suit who looked like he did contested estates regularly. Dad was there too, sitting behind Theodore. Mom came but sat in the back. Sylvia didn't show up. Grace told me later that was strategic. They didn't want the judge to see the whole family ganging up on me. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Morrison. She'd reviewed both filings in advance. She started by asking Theodore's lawyer to present his case for why the will should be contested. Theodore's lawyer laid it out. Harold had been elderly and isolated when he updated his will. Only one grandchild had regular contact with him during that period. That grandchild was now set to receive a substantial inheritance while the others received equal amounts. The timing was suspicious. The fact that Harold had written an unusually detailed letter specifically praising that grandchild suggested possible manipulation. They were requesting a full competency evaluation based on medical records and witness testimony about Harold's mental state. Judge Morrison asked if they had evidence of incompetence, medical documentation, statements from doctors, anything concrete. Theodore's lawyer admitted that they didn't have medical records yet. They'd requested them, but the process took time. However, they had testimony from family members about Harold's declining memory and judgment in his final years. The judge looked unimpressed. She turned to Grace. Grace presented our counterargument. Harold had been evaluated by his primary care physician 6 months before his death as part of his transition to assisted living. The evaluation found him mentally competent with no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment. Harold had worked with his attorney to update his will, and that attorney had found him to be of sound mind and clear intention. Harold had explicitly stated his reasons for equal distribution in a detailed letter that demonstrated thoughtful consideration of each grandchild's character and circumstances. Grace then addressed the undue influence claim. She explained that I had maintained regular contact with Harold for 2 years, but so had his neighbor Peter. So had the staff at the assisted living facility. So had his attorney, Grace Chin, who'd met with him multiple times. I'd never been alone with Harold in a context where I could have pressured him without witnesses. The visits were documented. The relationship was genuine and observed by others. Then Grace played the recordings. She'd put together a compilation, maybe 15 minutes total, Grandpa's voice talking about his disappointment in how his family had become, about how his son had turned into the kind of man who measured everything in dollars and status, about how his grandchildren had learned those same values, except for one who still seemed to understand what actually mattered. The recording had Grandpa explicitly stating that he was leaving equal shares to all 5 grandchildren because fairness was more important than efficiency, that he knew some people would argue certain grandchildren needed or deserved more, but that his money wasn't a reward for achievement. It was a final gift to everyone equally. The judge listened to the whole thing. Then she asked Theodore's lawyer if he had any response to the audio evidence. Theodore's lawyer argued the recordings could have been made under duress or could have been edited. He'd need time to have them authenticated. Judge Morrison said the recordings would be authenticated if this proceeded to trial, but based on what she'd heard today, she was not convinced there was sufficient evidence of incompetence or undue influence to warrant further litigation. Harold had been evaluated as mentally competent. He'd worked with an attorney. He'd clearly articulated his reasoning. The fact that one grandchild had maintained closer contact wasn't evidence of manipulation. It was evidence of relationship. She asked Theodore's lawyer directly if he had any concrete evidence beyond speculation and family testimony that Harold had been incompetent or that I had manipulated him. Theodore's lawyer hesitated. Then he said they would need time to gather additional evidence and expert testimony. Judge Morrison said she wasn't going to freeze an estate for months or years based on fishing expeditions. She was validating the will as written. The contest was dismissed. Probate would proceed with equal distribution to all 5 beneficiaries as Harold had specified. The hearing was over in less than an hour. Theodore stood up fast enough that his chair scraped loudly. He walked out without looking at me. Dad followed him. Their lawyer packed up his briefcase and left. Grace told me we'd won. The will was valid. Nobody could challenge it again without new evidence. And there wasn't any new evidence to find. I'd be receiving my full inheritance once probate completed, probably within 3 to 4 months. I went back to work that afternoon, told Connie how it went. She gave me the rest of the day off, but I worked anyway. I needed something normal. Theodore texted me that night. He said I destroyed his future. His MBA program wouldn't hold his spot. He'd have to reapply next year, and there was no guarantee he'd get in again. All because I couldn't be reasonable about money that I'd manipulated Grandpa into leaving me. I didn't respond. Sylvia texted the next day. The house had fallen through. She and Atlas had to renew their current lease. Atlas was reconsidering their engagement because he was questioning her judgment and her family situation. She said I'd ruined her life. I didn't respond to her either. Mom called me that week. She said Dad wasn't speaking to her because she'd refused to testify at the hearing about my supposed mental health issues. She'd told Dad she wouldn't lie under oath. Now Dad thought she had chosen me over the family. Mom was caught in the middle, and it was tearing her apart. I told Mom I was sorry she was in that position, but I hadn't created it. Dad had created it when he decided to exclude me from Grandpa's funeral and then tried to steal my inheritance. These were consequences of his choices, not mine. Mom asked if I'd consider giving Theodore and Sylvia some of my inheritance voluntarily now that the legal fight was over, just to help them out, to show there were no hard feelings. I told Mom no, I had hard feelings. I had a lot of them. And my inheritance was going toward getting out of my studio apartment, fixing my car, maybe going back to school. It was going toward building the life Grandpa wanted me to have. Mom said I'd changed. The son she raised would have put family first. I told her the son she raised had put family first for 30 years, and it had gotten him treated like garbage. Maybe she didn't like this version of me, but this was the version that existed after everything they'd done. Mom hung up. The inheritance came through 4 months later. $100,000, exactly as Grandpa intended. I got a cashier's check and deposited it the same day. I paid off my credit cards. I paid off my car and got the transmission fixed. I moved into a better apartment, a real one-bedroom with working AC and a landlord who actually responded to maintenance requests. I started taking classes at the community college, working toward finishing the degree I dropped out of 10 years ago. I haven't spoken to Theodore or Sylvia since the hearing. Dad sent me one text saying I was no longer welcome at family events, which was fine since I'd barely been included before. Mom still texts occasionally, usually around holidays, asking if I'm ready to reconcile. I'm not. The extended family has mostly stopped reaching out. Aunt Carol blocked me on social media. Some cousins take my side, some take Theodore's. Most just want to avoid the whole situation. I visited Grandpa's grave last month, brought flowers, told him the inheritance came through and I was using it the way he'd hoped. That I was building something real with it, not just spending it. That I missed our Sunday afternoon conversations. Someone had left flowers there recently, newer than mine. I don't know who. Maybe Peter. Maybe one of the other grandchildren who got their shares and felt guilty about how everything went down. I'm doing okay. Better than okay, actually. I'm not rich, but I'm stable in a way I've never been before. I'm taking classes I actually care about. I'm living somewhere that doesn't make me anxious every time something breaks. And I learned something important through all this. Family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up, who values you, who treats you like you matter. Grandpa understood that. That's why he split everything equally, but made sure I knew he'd seen me. Really seen who I was. Theodore still has his career. Sylvia still has Atlas, though I heard through Mom they postponed the wedding. Dad still has his business connections and his disappointment. Mom still has her position as the family mediator, always trying to keep peace at everyone else's expense. And I have my inheritance, my education, and my self-respect. I know which side of that equation I choose. So, yeah, I showed up to Red Lobster that Tuesday night, and they tried to cut me out. They thought I'd just accept it because that's what I'd always done before. They were wrong. Sometimes the loser brother isn't actually the loser. Sometimes he's just the one who knows what matters. Thanks for following this story on Hidden Lies.